Radio podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Homeschool History. I'm Greg Jenner and I've spent my whole career making history fun on the TV show Horrible Histories and more recently on the BBC podcast You're Dead to Me, though that's mostly for the grown-ups. With everyone being cooped up in the house, I thought I'd deliver a snappy history lesson to entertain and educate the whole family. Who says that homeschooling can't be a bit of fun? This week we're off on an adventure all the way back to ancient Egypt to meet the famous Queen Cleopatra. Cleopatra was probably born in ancient Egypt around the year 69 BCE, nearly 2,100 years ago. Amazingly, Egyptian civilization lasted for so long that by the time she was born, Egyptians had already stopped building pyramids 1,500 years beforehand, meaning Cleopatra is closer in time to us than she was to the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Whoa!
Isn't that weird? The pyramids were already ancient history to her, and she's ancient history to us. Another confusing thing is that Cleopatra was descended from Greeks. 260 years before her birth, Alexander the Great had conquered the kingdom and one of his generals, Ptolemy, had taken over when Alexander died. Lots of Ptolemies ruled after him, until we get to Ptolemy XII, who was Cleo's dad. It explains why Cleopatra spoke Greek and had a Greek name, because Cleopatra is Greek for famous like her father. In 52 BCE, Pharaoh Ptolemy XII decided to make Cleopatra his co-ruler when she was about 17. He soon died, and since she was a girl, she wasn't allowed to rule on her own. Instead, she had to co-reign with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra was not happy about this. And if you think that sounds awkward, well, their co-reign was probably sealed with a ceremonial marriage. Yes, Cleopatra had to marry her own kid brother. Weird. For the first 18 months or so, there was pretty much no mention of little Ptolemy in any of the official documents. She basically did the ancient version of cropping him out of all their joint social media posts. However, when Ptolemy turned 13, he tried to get rid of Cleopatra, as he was sick of her hogging everything. In 49 BCE, he succeeded in shoving her off the throne. So she went off to Syria to raise an army to fight her brother, Brusband? Yeah, Brusband. And civil war now broke out in Egypt. And things weren't looking good elsewhere either. By the summer of 48 BCE, a huge civil war was raging in the Roman world too, between two old friends, Julius Caesar and a chap called Pompey. After losing a key battle against Caesar, Pompey ran away to seek shelter in Egypt. This was not a smart move, because little Ptolemy captured him and thought, aha, if I execute Pompey, I'll impress Julius Caesar and then he will back me against my sister Cleopatra. Big mistake. You might think that Julius Caesar would be pleased to hear that Pompey was dead, but actually it really wasn't okay for a non-Roman to kill a Roman. Oops. A furious Caesar arrived in Egypt and summoned Ptolemy and Cleopatra to explain themselves in person. And this was really tricky for Cleo because she was at war with her brother and she couldn't just confidently sashay into the palace and say morning because she'd be arrested. So what did she do? The famous Greek philosopher Plutarch said she snuck into the palace by rolling herself up in a duvet and having it delivered to Caesar.
Special delivery!
Anyway, Cleopatra did manage to have her sneaky meeting with Caesar, and she clearly impressed him. Not only did she get him to take her side against Ptolemy, she got him to fancy her too. And they became a power couple. Ptolemy was so angry when he saw them together, he threw his crown on the floor. And just like that, Cleopatra was back on the throne, and it was her Brusband who was out on his ear. A grumpy Ptolemy sent for his army to besiege the city of Alexandria, while Cleopatra and Caesar were still in it. They tried all sorts of stuff to force the people of Alexandria to surrender. They even pumped raw sewage into the drinking water so that people couldn't drink it. I mean, that's literally fighting dirty. But then Roman reinforcements showed up and defeated Ptolemy at the Battle of the Nile. His boat sank and he tried to swim to safety, but Ptolemy drowned because his golden armour was too heavy. And that, kids, is why life jackets are not made of metal.
Smart!
So Cleopatra and Caesar were victorious. Hooray! And they celebrated with an elaborate cruise down the Nile. How relaxing. Cleopatra was now in her 20s, ruling Egypt again, and she was really popular with her people. One reason for this was that she spoke Egyptian as well as Greek. In fact, she spoke lots of languages, and she also varied her fashion tastes as well, dressing in both Greek styles in the palace and then wearing traditional Egyptian clothes for her official duties when she was seen by other Egyptians. Although she was basically ruling on her own, she still needed a male co-ruler. So, you guessed it, she married another one of her little brothers. And yes, he was also called Ptolemy.
Another one?
Ptolemy the 14th this time. Honestly, this family had no imagination when it came to names. Despite this, Caesar and Cleopatra continued to be boyfriend and girlfriend, which you might think is surprising seeing as, well, she was already married. But so was Caesar, to a woman called Calpurnia. Oh, it's all a bit awkward. Soon, Cleopatra gave birth to a baby boy. We don't know for certain if Julius Caesar was the daddy, but she named the kid Caesarion, which means Little Caesar. So that is not a subtle hint, is it? As if being a queen wasn't impressive enough, Cleopatra now said she was the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. She even appeared in public dressed as Isis. Talk about dressing for the job you want rather than the job you've got. You'd think Cleo would put her feet up and enjoy being a new mum, but instead she went to Rome to go and chill out with Caesar. But it wasn't really a romantic getaway for very long, because while she was in Rome, on March 15th, 44 BCE, on the famous Ides of March, Julius Caesar was murdered by his friends. They thought he'd become too powerful. Cleo was in a strange land, in the middle of a violent takeover, her boyfriend was dead, and she wasn't popular with Roman politicians. They didn't think that women should be allowed to run a country. Mind you, even though the politicians and the generals hated her, Cleopatra was very popular with Roman women. She was a real trendsetter. They loved her clothes and her hairstyle, and they tried to copy them. Imagine if she'd been on Instagram. Her hashtag would be Nile Style. With Caesar dead, Cleopatra got out of Rome pretty sharpish, and having lost her boyfriend, she now also lost her husband too. Yes, Cleopatra had Ptolemy the 14th quietly bumped off, probably with poison. It meant that she could now make her son, Caesarion, her co-ruler. Meanwhile, after Caesar's death, there were 3 men sharing power in Rome, and one of them was called Mark Antony. He sent loads of letters to Cleopatra as he wanted to see if she was on his side. And when they did finally meet up, Cleopatra spared no expense in trying to impress him, including dressing up as, of course, the goddess Isis. If you've got a look, flaunt it. Mark Antony was soon Cleopatra's ally. She must have been quite the sweet talker. Imagine her at the United Nations today. She'd probably solve climate change in an afternoon and then spend the rest of the time flirting with the French president.
Bonjour, Monsieur Macron. Tu es très beau. Je t'adore. Oh la la.
Cleopatra had already transformed one famous Roman general from grumpy soldier into boyfriend material, so it's no surprise that she did it again with Mark Antony. They became a real power couple in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Although Cleopatra kept having to foot the bill for Mark Antony's failed attempts at invading places. He wasn't very good at it. She was finally with someone who wasn't her little brother, so she was making progress, but she still had to keep cleaning up after all these silly men. Meanwhile, however, one of the other Roman leaders, Octavian, was doing much better in the West. Oh, and did I mention Mark Antony was married to Octavian's sister? Oh, what a messed up family this is. It's like an episode of Hollyoaks around here. Cleopatra and Mark Antony did cause one really big scandal, and it definitely wasn't a romantic one. Cleopatra had a sister called Arsinoe, who apparently had been plotting to steal Cleo's throne. Cleopatra ordered Mark Antony to arrange for her to be murdered, even though she was hiding in the sacred temple of Artemis. The Romans were outraged. Temples were no place for violence. Well, apart from the sacrificial animals, obviously. That was 3 siblings that had died because of her. Having Cleopatra in your family was clearly very bad for your health. Cleopatra now became pregnant by Mark Antony, and they had twins. And then they had another 3rd child. When Mark Antony finally managed to successfully invade Armenia, he said that the twins, called Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, would one day rule over this new part of the Roman Empire. And this very much enraged the people in Rome, because they saw it as their new empire being handed to some random foreigners. The Roman Senate now declared that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were official enemies of Rome. Oh dear. In 31 BCE, a big army was sent against them, leading to a huge naval battle at a place called Actium. It did not go well for Antony and Cleopatra. They lost. Cleopatra ran off, so Mark Antony dropped everything mid-battle and ran off as well. Meanwhile, the victor Octavian, whose sister was married to Mark Antony, of course, now became the first ever Roman emperor, taking the name of Caesar Augustus. But he wasn't done there. He now invaded Egypt. Yikes! To avoid the humiliation of being captured, Mark Antony stabbed himself and died in Cleopatra's arms. It was a very sad story. And then even worse, Cleopatra died by poisoning herself. Some say she forced a venomous snake to bite her, but this probably isn't true. It was a tragic end for Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But in a surprising twist, their 3 kids were sent off to Rome, not to be thrown in jail, but to be raised by Mark Antony's widow, who of course was also the sister of Octavian, the man who just defeated them in battle. Mark Antony and Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene, went on to become a queen in her own right, as did her daughter, also called Cleopatra Selene. I told you about this family and their lacking of imagination with names, didn't I? Anyway, that means that Queen Cleopatra was herself mother and grandmother to 2 other Queen Cleopatras. Impressive. And that brings us to the end of Cleopatra's story. Now it's time for the quiz. Are you ready? Here we go. Question 1. Cleopatra is a Greek name meaning what? Question 2. Named after a Greek general, what name did Cleopatra's father and little brothers share? Question 3. Cleopatra saw herself as the living version of which Egyptian goddess? Question 4. Cleopatra's first husband was her brother Ptolemy XIII, but why did he drown in battle? Question 5 is, according to one story, what did Cleopatra wrap herself up in to sneak in to see Julius Caesar? Okay, let's do the answers. The answer to question 1, Cleopatra's name in Greek meant famous like her father. The answer to question 2, her brothers and her father were called Ptolemy. The answer to question 3, the Egyptian goddess was Isis. The answer to question 4, Ptolemy XIII drowned because his armour was too heavy. And the answer to question 5, apparently she wrapped herself up in a duvet. How did you do? If you didn't get all 5, that's okay. Why not listen to a different episode on the podcast and see if you can get 5 there instead? Tune in next time for some more homeschool history. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast on BBC Sounds so you never miss an episode. Thank you for listening, take care, and goodbye.